It was an ordinary day in the bustling courtroom of Maplewood County. The air buzzed with a mix of tension and routine, a typical Monday morning. People filed into the room, some clutching documents nervously, others wearing stoic expressions, as if this wasn't their first encounter with the judicial system. At the head of the room, Judge Arthur Campbell adjusted his glasses, tapping his gavel against the wooden desk to bring order to the proceedings. Judge Campbell was well known in Maplewood County. A tall, stern man in his late 50s with silver hair and a crisp black robe, he prided himself on running a strict but fair courtroom. Also, he believed. To him, the law was black and white, as rigid and unyielding as the marble columns of the courthouse itself. He didn't see people, he saw cases, rules, and procedures. It wasn't about who you were but about what you did, also he told himself. Among the crowd that morning was Elaine Thompson, a poised woman in her early 40s, dressed in a sharp navy blue blazer. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind that turned heads without trying. Her hair was neatly styled, and her calm demeanor seemed to stand in stark contrast to the anxiety rippling through the room. Elaine had faced countless challenges in her life, and today's court appearance felt more like an inconvenience than a major event. Her case was called. Judge Campbell barely glanced up as she approached the podium. To him, she was just another defendant in a long line of individuals he'd deal with that day. "Elaine Thompson," he said in his deep, authoritative voice, scanning the case file in front of him. His tone carried no malice, just the mechanical efficiency of a man accustomed to making quick judgments. "Yes, Your Honor," Elaine replied, her voice steady and polite. She wasn't one to lose her composure, even in situations like this. The case was straightforward, at least on the surface. Elaine was there for a minor parking violation, something she had contested due to what she believed was an error in the system. The ticket had been issued on a date and time when she was attending a public event miles away, but her appeal had somehow landed her in court. Judge Campbell skimmed through the details. To him, it was an open and shut case. A parking violation was a parking violation, and Maplewood County took its municipal codes seriously. He didn't bother to ask for much clarification or context. Instead, he delivered a summary judgment, fining Elaine the maximum penalty for the infraction. "That will be $250, Judge Campbell announced, his voice echoing through the silent room. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery. Parking violations rarely warranted such a steep fine, but Judge Campbell had a reputation for enforcing rules to the letter. Elaine, however, remained composed. Her expression didn't flicker, not with anger, not with shock. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if weighing her next words carefully. "Your Honor," she began, her voice measured but firm. "With all due respect, I believe there's been a mistake. I'd like the opportunity to provide further evidence." Judge Campbell leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Miss Thompson, this court doesn't have time to entertain unnecessary appeals. The fine stands. If you disagree, you may file an official motion for review." Elaine's calm demeanor persisted, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something sharp and deliberate. She gave a small nod, as if filing away this moment for later. The judge's words had been dismissive, almost condescending, but she wasn't the type to lash out. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you, Your Honor," and stepped away from the podium. As Elaine left the courtroom, whispers followed her. Some spectators sympathized with her plight. Others shook their heads, resigned to what they saw as the cold bureaucracy of the justice system. Judge Campbell, meanwhile, moved on to the next case without a second thought. What the judge didn't know, what no one in the room knew, was who Elaine Thompson truly was. She wasn't just a woman contesting a parking ticket. She was a state legislator, a fierce advocate for social justice, and a champion of accountability. Elaine had spent her career fighting for fairness and transparency in the very system she now found herself navigating. And this moment, this seemingly trivial fine, was about to become much more than just a line item on a court docket. As Elaine walked out of the courthouse, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her chief of staff. The words were simple but loaded with implications. "Ready when you are." Elaine smiled faintly. She wasn't one to make waves for the sake of making waves, but when it came to standing up for what was right, she didn't hesitate. This wasn't just about a parking fine anymore. It was about holding people accountable, even judges who thought they were above scrutiny. Back in the courtroom, Judge Campbell carried on with his day, blissfully unaware that his decision had set off a chain of events he would soon regret. Elaine Thompson was no ordinary defendant, and her story was far from over. What happened next would not only shake Maplewood County, but also spark a conversation that echoed far beyond its borders. The warm sunlight outside the courthouse felt like a contrast to the cold dismissal Elaine had just faced. She paused on the steps, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. Her calm, composed exterior remained intact, but beneath it, a quiet determination burned. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone in power who underestimated her, and she doubted it would be the last. Still, she couldn't shake the thought that today's encounter was emblematic of something larger, something she had fought against for years. Elaine glanced at her phone again, rereading the message. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a signal. Her chief of staff, Marcus, was always a step ahead, anticipating her needs before she voiced them. She dialed his number, and he answered on the first ring. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady. "Do we have the records?" "All of them," Marcus replied without hesitation. "It's worse than we thought. Campbell's been pulling stunts like this for years. Over 70 cases with questionable judgments. Most of them involve low-income defendants. Many of them are minorities." Elaine felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a deep, simmering frustration. She had seen this pattern too many times. People like Judge Campbell operated with impunity, hidden behind the veneer of authority and the assumption that no one would challenge them. "Let's move forward," Elaine said after a pause. "Quietly for now. I want to see the full file before we make any decisions." "Understood," Marcus said. "I'll send it to your secure email." Elaine hung up, slipping her phone back into her pocket. The courthouse loomed behind her, its imposing facade a reminder of the systemic barriers she had spent her life trying to dismantle. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had likely walked out of that same building feeling powerless, dismissed, and unseen. She got into her car, her mind racing as she drove back to her office. Maplewood County was small, but its problems were far from unique. Across the state and the country, people like Judge Campbell held positions of power, shaping lives with decisions that often went unchecked. Elaine had made it her mission to bring accountability to these spaces, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Back at her office, Marcus was waiting for her, a laptop open on the table and a thick folder of documents beside it. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man in his early 30s, with a knack for uncovering the kind of information others preferred to keep buried. As Elaine walked in, he gestured to the folder. "Everything we could find on Campbell," he said. "It's a lot." Elaine sat down, flipping through the pages. There were case summaries, transcripts, and even a few personal accounts from people who had faced Campbell in court. The pattern was unmistakable. Campbell's rulings disproportionately targeted people of color, low-income individuals, and those who didn't have the resources to fight back. He handed out maximum fines for minor infractions, dismissed legitimate appeals, and seemed to go out of his way to make life harder for those who already struggled. "This isn't just a bad judge," Elaine said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "This is systemic abuse." Marcus nodded. "And he's been getting away with it for years. The county board knows. They've done nothing. Too much red tape, and no one wants to rock the boat." Elaine leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. The weight of the information settled on her, but so did a sense of purpose. This wasn't just an opportunity to hold one man accountable. It was a chance to shine a light on a broken system. "Let's compile everything," she said. "Every questionable ruling, every complaint. I want a complete picture before we take this public." Marcus hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure about this? Going after a judge isn't exactly low risk. He's got connections." Elaine met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "If we go do it, who will?" For the next several hours they worked in silence, piecing together the puzzle. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Judge Campbell's actions were part of a larger issue. It wasn't just about him. It was about a system that allowed people like him to operate unchecked. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow through the office windows, Elaine leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. They had enough evidence to move forward, but the question remained, how? "We'll lead our lives," she said finally, breaking the silence. "People who can back us up when this gets messy." Marcus nodded. "I've already reached out to a few advocacy groups. They're interested, but they want to see how far we're willing to go." Elaine smiled faintly. "We're going all the way. This isn't just about Campbell. It's about every person who's ever been steamrolled by a system that's supposed to protect them." Marcus grinned. "That's what I thought you'd say." As the night wore on, Elaine found herself thinking back to her own experiences with the justice system. She remembered the first time she walked into a courtroom. not as a legislator, but as a scared young woman trying to fight for custody of her younger siblings after their parents passed away. She had seen the same dismissive attitudes, the same biases, and had fueled her determination to create change. Now she had the chance to do just that. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. People like Judge Campbell didn't go down without a fight, and the system he represented wouldn't change overnight. Still, Elaine had always believed that progress was worth the struggle, and this time would be no different. As she and Marcus packed up for the night, Elaine glanced at the folder one last time. It was heavy with evidence, but it also carried the weight of responsibility. She knew that once they took the next step, there would be no turning back. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Let's make it count." The next day, Elaine woke early, the events of the previous day still fresh in her mind. She had a meeting scheduled with a group of local activists, and she knew it would be a crucial step in building the coalition they needed. As she got ready, she couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and resolve. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves, and Elaine was ready for whatever came next. Elaine entered the community center where the meeting was being held, greeted by a modest crowd of local activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens. The room hummed with quiet conversation, the kind of subdued energy that builds before something important happens. As Elaine walked in, a few heads turned and the chatter softened. She wasn't just a guest, she was someone they were counting on. The weight of their unspoken expectations rested on her shoulders, but she didn't falter. Marcus had already arrived and was busy setting up a small presentation at the front of the room. He gave Elaine a quick nod as she approached, his expression unreadable, but his confidence in her evident. Elaine took a deep breath, scanning the room. Among the faces, she recognized a few key figures. Claire, a longtime community organizer who had fought tooth and nail for fair housing policies, and Hector, a former public defender who had witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of systemic bias in the courts. Their presence alone was a reminder of how deeply entrenched these issues were. Elaine began her presentation by addressing the group directly, her voice calm but firm. She outlined the findings Marcus had compiled, walking them through the patterns of bias and abuse evident in Judge Campbell's rulings. As she spoke, she could see the emotions ripple through the room: shock, anger, and a simmering frustration that matched her own. This wasn't news to many of them, but seeing it laid out so plainly made it impossible to ignore. When she finished, Claire was the first to speak. "We've known something was wrong for years, but no one's been able to prove it. This is different. This is proof." Hector nodded in agreement, but proof isn't enough. Campbell's not just a bad judge. He's part of the system that protects people like him. Going after him is going to take more than just evidence. Elaine listened carefully, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew they were right. Exposing Campbell's actions was only the first step. To create real change, they would need to rally public support, navigate the legal system, and withstand the inevitable backlash. "That's why we're here," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't just about one judge. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this. But we can't do it alone. We need your help." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, one by one, people began to speak. Some shared their own stories about family members who had been unfairly fined, neighbors who had lost their homes, and friends who had been caught in an endless cycle of debt and despair. Others offered ideas, strategies, and connections that could help. As the meeting continued, a plan began to take shape. They would start by raising public awareness, organizing rallies and press conferences to bring Campbell's actions into the spotlight. At the same time, they would work behind the scenes to file formal complaints, gather more evidence, and build a case that could stand up to scrutiny. It was an ambitious plan, but it was the kind of bold, comprehensive approach Elaine knew they needed. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The initial anger and frustration had transformed into a sense of purpose, a determination to see this fight through no matter how long it took. Elaine left the community center feeling a renewed sense of hope. She wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting alongside a community that believed in the same vision of fairness and accountability. But not everyone was on their side. The next morning, as Elaine checked her email, she found a message from an anonymous sender. The subject line was simple: "Stop." Inside was a single line of text: "You don't know who you're dealing with." Elaine stared at the screen for a moment, her mind racing. It wasn't the first time she received a threat, but it was a stark reminder of the stakes. Whoever had sent the message wasn't just trying to intimidate her, they were trying to protect something. and that only made her more determined to move forward. She forwarded the email to Marcus, who called her almost immediately. "We need to report this," he said, his tone urgent. "We will," Elaine replied. "But first, I want to know who sent it." Marcus hesitated. "You think it's connected to Campbell?" Elaine nodded even though he couldn't see her. "I don't think it's a coincidence." Over the next few days, Elaine and Marcus worked tirelessly, juggling their investigation with the growing public campaign. The rallies were gaining traction, drawing attention from local media and even a few state-level outlets. People were starting to talk, and the pressure was building. But so was the resistance. Elaine began noticing subtle changes. Her phone calls were being dropped more frequently, and her emails took longer to send. At first, she thought it was just bad luck or a technical issue, but Marcus was less convinced. "They're trying to rattle us," he said one evening, gesturing to the stack of paperwork on his desk. "Whoever they are." Elaine couldn't argue with him. The opposition wasn't just coming from Judge Campbell, it was coming from the system that protected him. And the closer they got to uncovering the truth, the harder it was pushing back. Despite the challenges, Elaine refused to back down. She knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was worth it. Every person who shared their story at the rallies, every volunteer who joined the campaign, and every headline that brought more attention to the issue was a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place. But as the weeks went on, the tension only grew. Threatening messages became more frequent, and the pushback from Campbell's allies became more overt. It was clear that they were running out of time. If they wanted to make a real impact, they needed to act soon. One evening, as Elaine sat in her office going over the latest case files, Marcus walked in with a grim expression. "We got a problem," he said, placing a folder on her desk. Elaine opened it and felt her stomach drop. Inside were documents suggesting that someone had been digging into her past, looking for anything they could use against her. It wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a warning. "They're trying to scare you," Marcus said, his voice low, "but they're not going to find anything." Elaine nodded, her jaw set. "Let them try. This isn't about me. It's about the people who've been hurt by this system. And I'm not stopping until we get justice." The fight was far from over, but Elaine knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone. And as long as she had the support of her community, she was ready to face whatever came next. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, with the movement gaining traction and the stakes climbing higher than ever. Elaine found herself at the center of a storm, fielding calls from reporters, attending strategy meetings, and continuing to connect with the people whose lives had been directly affected by Judge Campbell's rulings. The rallies had grown from modest gatherings to full-blown demonstrations, with hundreds of people crowding the courthouse steps, holding signs demanding accountability and change. The air was electric with a mixture of hope and urgency, but underneath it all was a growing tension. Marcus had been working overtime, sifting through records and piecing together the story that Elaine would soon present to the public. Late one night, as they sat in her office surrounded by stacks of documents, he leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. "We got almost everything we need," he said, glancing at her. "But there's one piece missing." Elaine frowned, feeling the weight of his words. "What is it?" "A whistleblower," Marcus replied. "Someone on the inside who can confirm what we found. Without that, they'll dismiss this as speculation, no matter how strong the evidence is." Elaine nodded slowly, her mind already racing. She knew he was right. They needed someone willing to speak out, someone who had seen the corruption firsthand and was willing to risk everything to expose it. But finding that person wouldn't be easy. As the days passed, the pressure continued to mount. The media was starting to dig deeper into Campbell's history, and the judge himself had gone quiet, refusing to make any public statements. But behind the scenes, Elaine knew he was preparing for a fight. The threats against her had grown more sophisticated, with anonymous callers leaving cryptic messages, and her office receiving unsolicited legal complaints meant to tie her up in court. Then, one afternoon, a breakthrough came. Elaine was sitting in her office, going over the latest strategy memo, when her assistant knocked on the door and handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, unsigned but unmistakably sincere. The writer claimed to be a former court clerk who had worked under Campbell and had witnessed his biased practices firsthand. They expressed regret for staying silent for so long, but stated they were now willing to come forward, under the condition of anonymity. Elaine felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. This was what they had been waiting for. She immediately called Marcus, who rushed over to review the letter. Together, they crafted a response, inviting the whistleblower to meet in a secure location. The stakes were higher than ever now, but Elaine knew they couldn't move forward without this critical piece. The meeting was set for the following night in a quiet diner on the edge of town. Elaine and Marcus arrived early, scanning the nearly empty restaurant for any signs of trouble. The tension was palpable as they waited, the minutes ticking by agonizingly slowly. Finally, the door opened, and a nervous-looking man in his late 40s stepped inside, clutching a worn briefcase. He introduced himself as Daniel and quickly took a seat across from Elaine and Marcus. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the briefcase, revealing a stack of documents that he claimed would prove Campbell's misconduct. He spoke in a hushed voice, glancing around the diner as if expecting someone to overhear. He recounted stories of cases where Campbell had deliberately skewed rulings, targeting minorities and favoring influential figures in the community. As Daniel spoke, Elaine could feel the weight of his words. This wasn't just about fines or court fees. It was about a pattern of abuse that had destroyed lives and eroded trust in the justice system. When he finished, he slid the documents across the table, his expression a mix of relief and fear. "You have to promise me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me you'll protect me. If they find out I talked." Elaine reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on his. "We'll do everything we can," she said firmly. "You're not alone in this." With Daniel's testimony and the evidence he provided, the case against Campbell was stronger than ever. But Elaine knew they were running out of time. The public was demanding answers, and the opposition was growing more desperate. That week, as the final rally before the formal hearing approached, tensions reached a boiling point. The courthouse steps were packed with protesters, their chants echoing through the city. Elaine stood at the center of the crowd, preparing to address them, when Marcus pulled her aside. His expression was grim. "We got a problem," he said, holding up his phone. On the screen was a news alert claiming that Elaine was under investigation for ethics violations, a blatant attempt to discredit her. Elaine felt a wave of anger rise within her. She had expected pushback, but this was a direct attack on her integrity. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "They're scared," she said, her voice steady. "That means we're getting close." But as she stepped up to the podium to speak, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The crowd roared in support as she began her speech, but her mind was already racing with the challenges ahead. She knew the hearing would be the culmination of everything they had worked for, a moment of truth that would either bring justice or leave their efforts in vain. The sun was setting as Elaine finished her speech, the sky painted in fiery shades of orange and red. As the crowd began to disperse, she stood on the courthouse steps, looking out over the city. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope that they might actually win. As Elaine stood on the courthouse steps, the crowd dispersing into the fading light of evening, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The vibration felt louder than it should have, cutting through the momentary calm she allowed herself to feel. Pulling it out, she glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number, but the subject line froze her in place. "You don't know everything." Her heartbeat quickened as she opened the email. Attached was a single audio file labeled Judge Campbell_confidential. Marcus, standing nearby and sensing her shift in focus, leaned in. "What is it?" he asked, concern flickering in his voice. Elaine didn't answer, instead clicking play. A grainy recording began to play, muffled voices coming through. It was clearly a conversation between Campbell and someone else, a voice she didn't recognize but could tell was smug, calculating. The exchange wasn't about one of Campbell's corrupt rulings. It was something much worse. The judge was talking about a larger operation, something that tied his behavior to a network of other powerful individuals, some of whom Elaine had never suspected of involvement. "They won't risk exposing us," Campbell said in the recording, his tone casual but filled with certainty. "Not even her. She's ambitious, but she doesn't have the reach to bring us all down. Not without implicating herself in the process." Elaine's blood ran cold. The voice on the other end chuckled. "Still, you might want to handle it. She's not just loud, she's effective, and people like her don't know when to stop." The recording ended abruptly, leaving Elaine staring her phone in stunned silence. Marcus grabbed her arm gently, his brow furrowed. "What the hell was that?" "It's bigger than we thought," Elaine whispered, her voice barely audible. "Campbell's not acting alone. He's part of something. Organized." Before Marcus could respond, her phone buzzed again. Another email, this time with no subject line. The message inside was chillingly direct. "You've gone too far. Walk away or there will be consequences." Elaine felt her chest tighten as she looked up at Marcus. "They're threatening me," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "And they're not bluffing." Marcus's jaw clenched as he paced for a moment, then stopped to face her. You realize this changes everything, right? If this is what it looks like, then we're not just exposing a corrupt judge. We're going after an entire system, and they're going to do whatever it takes to stop us. Elaine nodded, her resolve hardening despite the fear bubbling just beneath the surface. Then we need to move faster. We can't let them control the narrative. If we don't make this public soon, they'll bury us. The next few days were a blur of preparation, every moment laced with an underlying tension that never let up. Elaine and Marcus worked tirelessly to verify the audio file, cross-referencing it with what they'd already uncovered. As they delved deeper, the connections became clearer, revealing a web of influence that stretched far beyond Campbell's courtroom. There were hints of backroom deals, concealed payments, and strategic appointments that ensured the operation ran smoothly. But just as they began piecing together the final parts of the puzzle, another twist came crashing down. Late one night, as Elaine sat alone in her apartment, the phone rang. It was Daniel, the whistleblower, and his voice was shaking. "They know," he stammered, barely able to get the words out. "They know I talked to you." Elaine's heart sank. "Daniel, where are you? Are you safe?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I think someone's following me. I tried to go back to my place, but—" "Elaine, they've already been there. My things were moved. I can't." The line went dead. Elaine called his name repeatedly, her voice rising in panic, but there was no response. She immediately called Marcus, explaining what had happened. Within minutes, they had traced to Daniel's last known location and were on their way to find him. When they arrived, the scene was chilling. Daniel's car was parked haphazardly on the side of the road, the driver's side door ajar. There was no sign of him, but a piece of paper fluttered under the windshield wiper. Elaine pulled it out, her hands trembling. Written in bold, block letters were the words, "GSIS-URO-in-elite-of-Liverlaning." Marcus swore under his breath as Elaine stared at the note, her mind racing. She couldn't let this stop her, not now when they were so close, but the stakes had never felt higher. Not only was her career and reputation on the line, but now lives were being threatened. If she backed down, the system would continue unchallenged. But as she pushed forward, the consequences could be far greater than she had imagined. As they drove back, Elaine's phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a message from an ally within the state legislature, someone she trusted. The text read, "Urgent. Meet me at the Capitol first thing tomorrow. I have information you need." Elaine looked at Marcus, her expression a mix of determination and unease. "It's time to take this to the next level," she said, her voice steady. But in the back of her mind, the question loomed. How much further could they go before the cost became too great?